Welcome to everybody. Great to see you here at the 4th annual Groundhog Seminar. And this is sponsored by the American Public Philosophy Institute on campus here, which tries to advance a kind of natural law public philosophy kind of rooted in kind of traditional conception of human nature and what it is that fulfills human beings, and tries to bring that to bear on contemporary life, the political and social issues in America today. And we're fortunate to have Dr. Richard Dougherty, who has been chair of politics for many years, and who is a very noted scholar on Augustine and Aquinas. He's also done work on American constitutional issues, especially the presidency. And I continue to look forward eagerly to his book on the presidency, which will be emerging someday. He's actually been kind of on a roll in recent years, doing quite a bit of interesting work. And so we're very grateful to have him here today. He's going to be speaking on Biden, the swamp, and the Trump effect.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you for the invitation. When I first spoke with Professor Wolf about giving this talk back in the fall, I suggested to him that one idea I had in mind was to try to connect politics, and in particular education, with construction or building. Some of you know I enjoy light construction. I don't enjoy heavy construction, but there's a lot to learn about the nature of things by working with dirt and wood. But as Aristotle says, we should always begin with what people know, or at least with what they think that they know. And we know politics, so we should talk about politics. And I'm quite happy to do that. So what I want to do this morning is to say something about the Trump administration, the actions of the Trump administration, the successes or failures of the administration, and then say something about what we know, what we can learn from that in regard to the larger question of American politics, and where we are and where we might be going. And then that latter part will lead to some discussion of President Biden and what we might expect out of a Biden administration. And then I'll conclude with some, I hope, larger comments. So let me begin then with a review of some suggestions that I made in the immediate aftermath of the 2016 election on the prospects for the Trump administration. So as some of you know, our department likes to have a roundtable discussion after every significant election. I think we've done one like every 2 years. We did a partial one in the fall because the election wasn't really over before the students left for Thanksgiving for the break. But we are planning on doing a larger one at some point, perhaps soon. So you can check me if you want to fact check what I have to say about what I said in 2016, because I think the roundtable is up on YouTube. So here's a part of what I suggested we might get with the Trump administration, and then I'll intersperse what we actually got. So one, I suggested that there would be a wall or a fence or some degree of border security. Well, do we have one? Partial, right? Is it completed? No. The analysis of the extent to which the president was successful in constructing a wall, though, depends in part on what you consider to be a wall. And whether you consider a secondary wall at the border to be the same as a primary wall, and whether or not you value concrete over steel. So the president routinely referred to a concrete barrier. I think most of what has actually been built has been a steel barrier. In any case, it is true that some hundreds of miles of walls have actually been built since 2017. I think last year in the State of the Union address, the president referred to something like over 500 miles of wall having been built. Secondly, the president promised tax cuts, especially cuts in business taxes as a way of spurring the economy. That I think is undoubtedly true in the tax cuts that were put in place in 2017. Thirdly, I suggested there would be likely be some kind of reworking of the Affordable Care Act, sometimes, of course, referred to as Obamacare. That's a mistake, by the way. So for opponents of Obamacare, if you want to reform it or get rid of it or whatever it might be, repeal and replace was the language that was often used. Don't refer to it as Obamacare. It's too personal in that sense. And that was a mistake, I think, from the beginning. President Obama did not refer to it as Obamacare. He referred to the Affordable Care Act until it got passed, and then it seemed to be kind of popular. And then he started referring to it as Obamacare. But then when it was introduced and the website crashed time after time, he reverted to referring to it as the Affordable Care Act. But then he came to embrace it and call it Obamacare. So again, if you're opposed to Obamacare, the more you call it Obamacare, the more the defenders of the president, a former president, are going to oppose you. Well, okay, so what happened? Well, we did get a reworking of the Affordable Care Act to some extent, at least in the non-enforcement of the individual mandate, though the significant limitation on reform was occasioned by the singular vote of Senator McCain in a dramatic 2017 Senate vote, the one vote which rejected then the then Republican plan for reforming or reworking the Affordable Care Act. Senator McCain's vote, by the way, he said was not because he was opposed to reforming Obamacare. He had spoken about it, or the Affordable Care Act. He'd spoken about it routinely. It was a procedural question. He said, this isn't the way the Senate operates. It shouldn't be the way that we operate going forward. But it substantially killed the momentum of the reform. The incoming president promised that businesses and consumers would be afforded some degree of regulatory relief. That undoubtedly has happened, and I think has been the biggest underreported story of the last 4 years. So underreported that it's hard to get a real measurement of it, but undoubtedly it happened. Maybe we can say more about it later on. I also suggested, and this was not because the president raised the question, but rather because of the fact that President Trump had won the election. I made the suggestion that what would happen during the Trump administration is that there would be a revival of interest in the Constitution as a meaningful document with clauses and phrases that can act as a restraint on potential extraordinary executive action. This is undoubtedly true. One of the great successes of President Trump has been to get people to pay attention to the Constitution, much more so than I even imagined in November of 2016. So critics, for example, of legislative delegation of power, I'll say more about that later on, of regular violations of the separation of powers, of the independent use of executive orders and executive agreements, making or changing them. We discovered the emoluments clause in the Constitution, right? We discovered the multiple impeachment clauses of the Constitution, right? Which attracted the close attention now of even despisers of original intent. It is a remarkable, and I hope actually a long-lasting effect of the Trump administration, but I have my doubts about that. And then finally, I suggested that what might happen in the aftermath of the Trump victory was a struggle for control over the Republican Party apparatus and what it means to be a Republican, that would be up for grabs. This, I think, is undoubtedly true and will be for some time to come. That is, the way we see it, I would suggest, is in the question of whether or not the Republican Party is the party of Trump. Or is it something else? Or is it someone else who will provide the leadership going forward for the party, if there is leadership going forward for the party? By that, I mean a single person rather than a set of ideas or constructs, whatever it might be. And then, lastly, sorry, I said something about what would happen in the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, I suggested, would be looking for ways to stonewall the administration and the Republican-controlled Congress.
What?
And which, of course, undoubtedly happened. And I suggested that it does have some capacity for doing that, even in its minority status. Certainly, the Russia probe and the impeachments have been a large part of that. But the Democratic Party was also, in 2016, in the aftermath of the loss of the election in 2016, the Democratic Party was also in significant disarray. And I think it is still struggling to some extent to put together a unified vision and program for, again, moving forward, even in light of its victories in the last two election cycles. So this, I think, was true. So my suggestion, my prediction for what might happen in the Democratic Party was true, I think, and is still true in many ways. But the party was able to right itself and recapture now, of course, all three branches of government in relatively short time. But here I will caution that such changes have in fact become a bit ubiquitous in contemporary politics, and the margins between the parties are very small. And I remember the Republicans in the aftermath of the 2004 election, the re-election of President Bush, exulting in this as if this was the end of the Democratic Party. I mean, if 100,000 votes had gone a different way in 2004, Bush would have lost the election. This was not like a sweeping mandate, right, that he won. And of course, the Democrats then captured Congress in 2006 and then captured the presidency in 2008. And then they celebrated as if we were facing the dawn of a new age of their party's dominance of the American political scene. Needless to say, that didn't happen. They, in short order, lost the House, then they lost the Senate, and then they lost the presidency. Right? So these things happen. Right? I remember, just on this point, I remember back in the mid-1990s, I was interviewed by D Magazine, and the question that the person asked me was, well, this was the Republican Party had swept every election for every office in Dallas County. And so the lead line on the magazine cover was, "Is this the death of the Democratic Party?" And I said, yeah, until the next election. Like, he didn't believe me. Like, what happens, right? It's politics, right? Things change, right? And there's all kinds of reasons why they change. Okay, well, let me turn now to say something about something further about the Trump's effect and the accomplishments, but also questions that arise as a result of his administration. So one thing, and I think this goes to the question of his own rise to power in 2015, in political power, that is, in 2015 and 2016, and what that also tells us about American politics. But one thing I would say is the American people seem today to be far more willing to ask questions about the general direction of American policy, both domestic policy and foreign policy. One of those questions of late has been the extent to which, and certainly at the forefront, I think, of the Trump administration, has been the extent to which American interests have in fact been forwarded by the more robust presence of American personnel policies and monetary support, again, in both domestic and foreign affairs. And Trump, I would suggest, has allowed those questions to be asked across the board by progressives and conservatives alike. Progressives raise the question today, in part because of their opposition to Trump, but conservatives raise the questions because of their support of Trump. Here I have to qualify that. Conservative, you can't lump conservatives and support of Trump together. Okay, we can say more about this later. There are, of course, conservatives who support Trump. There are conservatives who are adamantly opposed to Trump. Right? So it's there's not a unified voice in that regard, and for good reason. By the way, I don't want to suggest that conservatives themselves are bifurcated, but that is internal. But they have their reasons for opposing him, and they have their reasons for supporting him. Part of the difficulty, of course, is that Trump's own policies seem to vacillate at times, perhaps a sign that he was being given conflicting advice from people who had his ear. So in foreign policy, for example, you might contrast the relative isolationism of someone like Rand Paul, who the president seemed to like, and the interventionism of people like John Bolton, who the president seemed to trust, if not like. The advice of people like this was often cited as a contributing factor to Trump's own vacillation. My own view in this regard tends towards the notion that the president didn't actually have an ideological bone in this regard, and as a result of that was willing to move in one direction or the other. And not, I think, because he thinks it would sell politically, but rather because his relative inexperience in foreign policy left him open to greater suggestiveness and reliance on such advice. But I think in the end, it seems as if the American people, or at least very close to half of them, were willing to go along for the ride. And I think many of them were compelled to think about the principles and policies of the American government in a way that they didn't perhaps so much prior to the advent of Trump. And I think it also is safe to say that Trump didn't really seem very concerned, to put it mildly, about what the intellectual and media elites in America and around the world thought about his comments and policies. Indeed, he seemed to relish rejecting their overtures, and perhaps with good reason, but I think with some negative consequences for him. And that opposition to mainstream elites had some ironic consequences. So I'll mention two. One is in, I think, the spring of 2019, the Council on Foreign Relations came out with a study that argued that Trump's foreign policy is actually not that bad, or that it is better than the articulation of it by Trump in his speeches and tweets, like Wagner's music, right? It's better than it sounds. But what would a Trump true believer do with that report? Right? You hear the Council on Foreign Relations is praising the president, right? So what do? Do you tout it by saying, look, even mainstream experts, right, are beginning to recognize how good Trump's policies really are? Or do you say that Trump is a loser? He's given up because he's now pleasing the Council on Foreign Relations, and we should distance ourselves from those policies because they're supported by the CFR. It's a quandary. It's a quandary. The second irony, in 2018, May of 2018, the Trump Office of Legal Counsel produced it. So the Office of Legal Counsel, those you know, they're the legal advisors to the president, telling him what they, in their view, what they think he could legally do and not do. Let me rephrase that. Telling him why it's okay to do what he wants to do. So the Trump Office of Legal Counsel produced a memorandum providing the legal justification for the use of military force in Syria in the previous months, targeting, the claim was, I don't say the claim was because I just don't know, chemical weapons facilities. Now, leaving aside the persuasiveness of the argument, one of the primary sources that the administration used as a basis for its claim that Syria possessed and had used chemical weapons in the ongoing war in Syria was reports from CNN. So how the administration can routinely attack CNN as a purveyor of quote unquote fake news, and yet find its reporting trustworthy enough to cite in a memo, a legal memo, is intriguing. But one important connected point here, though, is that the Trump Office of Legal Counsel, in that memo, as in a number of others, largely followed the opinions of the Office of Legal Counsel from previous administrations, including the Obama administration. In other words, when it came down to the question of justifying presidential military action, the administration, at least in this instance, followed the norms of previous presidents and didn't strike out on its own to provide new avenues for understanding and interpreting executive power. And I think that is largely true across the board. That is, the Trump administration may have occasionally and on the margins introduced some new rationales for acting. I think, for example, the original travel ban, or secondly, the diverting of emergency funds for building the wall. I think that was the spring of 2019. But there, I think there were something of a novel argument that got struck down and had to be reformulated. But by and large, I think the administration provided a continuum with previous administrations. And again, I mean for good or bad. If you like the way earlier presidents exercised their power, you probably liked what the Trump administration did, at least in terms of the process, right? The means and the argument for which it went about exercising that power. The ends you might disagree with, but I think, again, it was largely in harmony with what had gone before. And here I want to step back for a second, at least, more than a second, but Chris told me I have about 3 hours. So I want to address, I think, the crucial question. So this is a point that I try to drum the drumbeat for. I press the drumbeat for all the time, and that is the significance of the separation of powers, and in particular, congressional executive relations. Right? I think the separation of powers is the most important operative principle in the United States Constitution. And the past century plus, so again, I want to say something about the larger issue that's at stake here. The past century plus of American life has produced expansive government in both scope and size. And we might say the most obvious way in which we see that is in what we often call the Imperial Presidency. This is a book by Arthur Schlesinger Jr. in 1973. And surprisingly, talk of imperial presidency seems to arise only when we have Republican presidents. It's a remarkable thing. So, so during the Bush administration, during the Trump administration, you see these books like, The Return of the Imperial Presidency, the Imperial Presidency Strikes Back, all of these kinds of things. I'm going to guess that we will not see any about a Biden administration. I'm just guessing that. I don't know. Well, all right. An aside. Is that camera on? No. This was because this was really interesting, I think, and it's telling. And I don't know if I've mentioned this publicly before. I have in class. I guess that's public. So in the fall in 2008, I reviewed a manuscript for an academic press on executive power. And the book primarily focused on military power. I thought it was a well-done book. I think I recommended that it be published. And you submit, these things they're done blindly. You send them in. No one knows who you are, et cetera. Well, so this was 2008, and then after it was in December then of 2008. I got a phone call from the publisher, and this just doesn't happen. And I was like, what happened here? And he said, well, I wanted to talk to you about this book. And I said, okay, sure. He said, well, I wonder. He said, we like it and we'd like to publish it. He said, but I'm not sure if it's of use anymore. And I said, well, why not? And he said, well, because President Obama has just been elected. And so the whole book is about war and this kind of thing. And he's going to do away with that, right? I mean, we've solved that problem. It's like, this is a major academic press in the United States. And I said, My guess is that as long as we have human beings alive, we're going to have war, and we're going to have to deal with such things. And he said, well, for example, so an example he gave me was that the president said he was going to close down Guantanamo Bay. He did. Right. Okay. You can't just close it down. There's people there. What are you going to do with them? Right. And so, but this idea that, well, the president says something and it's going to happen because he said it. And I like that. I mean, that was clear from the guy's voice that he was in favor of this. That's going to solve the problem. Right? Didn't solve the problem. In fact, in the first 6 months, or I think of the Obama administration, well, anyway, his first trip to Europe, where he tried to persuade foreign powers to take some of these prisoners who are held in Guantanamo Bay. He got, I think, Oman to accept one prisoner. That was it. I'm not blaming him. I'm just saying that's the way things work, right? That's the way it works. And, okay, so a large part, I would say, so back to the question of the imperial presidency, though, the so-called imperial presidency. A large part of the increase in the power and reach of the executive has come as a result of the delegation of power to him by Congress. Right? Unconstitutional, in my view, but almost always legitimized by the courts. So here, the way it works is Congress has delegated its authority routinely, and then attempted to retain control over the administration of the law through congressional oversight. Congressional oversight is perhaps its most important regular exercise of power, and an exercise that it must engage in if it wants to push policies in the way that it favors. So I'll give you a domestic example of that. So for all of the discussion we've had over the last decade plus now, since the Affordable Care Act was passed, about the contraception mandate, that's not in the bill, right? It's not in the bill. Congress did not mandate that you provide contraceptive coverage. What Congress did was they gave that power to the Secretary of HHS to decide what has to be in any plan that is offered, any medical plan that is offered. So it's the Secretary of HHS who decided that. So every member of Congress can say, I had nothing to do with that. I did not impose that. It's those dirty rats, right? If they want to say that, it's those dirty rats in Washington, the bureaucrats, who did that, but not me. So again, if they want to get the policies that they favor, they have to exercise this kind of oversight over these creatures, right? So that they can push them in the direction that Congress wants, that they haven't actually legislated, the policies they haven't actually legislated. But it sometimes finds it difficult to commit, Congress sometimes finds it difficult to command that authority over the hydra-headed leviathan that is the federal government. In general, what we have seen, over the past century, certainly over the last half century, is conservatives supporting greater executive power and progressives promoting congressional authority. But the analysis along those fault lines is actually not that simplistic. So this is my one sort of political science point to make, maybe my first of two. So I would say advocates of a stronger executive have reason to be concerned about the likely consequences of the successes of that term, that is, of strengthening the executive over against the legislature. Because there's no assurance that conservatives will in fact be in control of the executive branch. And a stronger executive is often indicative of a stronger role for the federal government, that is, more centralized power. So too, advocates of congressional power or congressional control over the executive branch activities ought to be wary of the ready acceptance of delegations of power by Congress, even when that delegation leads at first blush to an expansion of the reach of the legislature. And here, I'll quote just one court case. So many of you know the Youngstown steel case in 1952. The question, so when the president attempted to seize the steel mills, Truman attempted to seize the steel mills, the question was brought to the fore, of whether he had the legitimate authority to do that. The question was brought to the fore by a consideration of the importance attached to the separation of powers. And if Congress, and I think this is true today, if Congress wants to rely on the principle of the separation of powers to prevent executive overreach, then it's worth considering what the consequences are of routinely blurring the lines of separation. That is, Congress cannot at one and the same time routinely violate the principle of separation of powers and then complain when a president acts upon that violation of the separation of powers. So here in the Youngstown case, Justice Douglas warned against the abandonment of a separation of powers. And this is what he said. This is Douglas in a concurring opinion in Youngstown. We pay a price for our system of checks and balances, for the distribution of power among the three branches of government. It is a price that today may seem exorbitant to many. That is, the price, of course, is inefficiency, right? It's hard to get something done. The separation of powers, that's of course partly why they're separated. So he says, today, a kindly president uses the seizure, that is, if you like this action, a kindly president uses the seizure power to effect a wage increase and to keep the steel furnaces in production. Yet tomorrow, another president might use the same power to prevent a wage increase, to curb trade unionists, to regiment labor as oppressively as industry thinks it has been regimented by this seizure. So you see what he's saying is what Congress has done at this point, roughly over a half century or so, is to accept a certain level of the blurring, right, of the lines between and among the separate powers. And that blurring is, but then it wants to turn around and say, no, there are actual limits to it, and we want you, the court, to enforce those limits. Justice Frankfurter then himself notes in the steel seizure case this. He says, so in other words, what we've had is a long tradition of Congress delegating power to the president in violation, one might say, of the principle of the separation of powers and the Constitution. And then Congress wants to turn around and say, well, but you can't go that far, right? Like that's a bridge too far, that's too much. So Frankfurter puts it this way: deeply embedded traditional ways of conducting government cannot supplant the Constitution or legislation, but they give meaning to the words of a text or supply them. It is an inadmissibly narrow conception of American constitutional law to confine it to the words of the Constitution and to disregard the gloss which life has written upon them.
And what happened?
Now, I want to suggest there's actually some truth. I think that's a very dangerous principle, right? That Frankfurter has articulated there. But there's some truth to it. That's actually what's happened.
Donated $6,000.
What's actually happened is Congress has been rather cavalier about granting power to executive or independent agencies, and then turned around and complained when those powers have been used in a way that Congress doesn't approve of. Okay, so enough of that, I think. Let me turn to say something about
I don't know who it went.
I don't want to talk about impeachment or the elections. Well, I'm happy to talk about that in the question and answer period. Well, I'll just say something briefly about impeachment. Well, not two impeachments. And one is, in terms of a sort of larger question, I would say that the impeachments now of the president have, in my view, diminished the power and effectiveness of impeachment. And we've had discussions for the last at least 30 years with every president of whether that president should be impeached. And other than, of course, President Clinton, people said, maybe we're not going to go down there because it was seen as crucial. Right? This is a fundamental move, and yet now that we've done it twice to the same president, I think going forward, it might just be the case that impeachment is seen as just another regular part of the political process. And I think I don't think that's a good thing. On the question of whether, and in regard to the first impeachment, I guess I would say this, and again, I'll say more about it in the question and answer period if you want to talk about it. I think one of the big mistakes of the first impeachment process was the president releasing not the transcript, but the account of his phone call with a foreign leader. Now, he did it, of course, because he thought it protected him. But what are the long-term consequences of that in foreign affairs for every foreign leader to now think the president of the United States might actually release a transcript? It wasn't exactly a transcript, but of our phone call. I think it's very dangerous. I think I've been reading a lot of Solzhenitsyn lately, and he talks about how in the Soviet Union, you couldn't have a conversation with someone because everything is bugged. And so you'd write everything down. So it'd be hours and hours of writing things back and forth, and then you burn all the notes, right? That might be the only way to go. And part of that is like, why are there all these people who are on the phone when you're having a conversation with a foreign leader? That seems to me just an opening for a disaster. But that's the way things work these days. Anyway, so I'd be happy to talk about that, but I want to move on to something more important, what I think is more important. And that is, I want to say something about the question of the swamp, because I put that in the title of the talk. First, is there a swamp? Well, here I would suggest we think along the lines of a former president of the university decades ago, who had gone over to the Rome campus and came back and told us, the faculty publicly, that one of the things he discovered was in the accounting records of the Rome campus was that there was a line for cash spent to buy off local officials. Now, of course, such things exist, but you don't put it down on paper. It's like, miscellaneous expenses or something like that. That's not, bribe paid to Italian contractor. So yeah, I think there is a swamp of some kind. And I do think it's the case that Trump's lack of knowledge of the inside ball game in Washington hurt him. And that lack of knowledge was shared with many of his appointees from outside the system. And, it's so much has happened in the last 4 years. It's hard to remember it all. But I would suggest you might go back and look at the number of people who served in the Trump administration in the first 6 months and who cycled through. Like, they didn't last a month, 3 weeks, who could imagine that someone like Anthony Scaramucci was actually in the administration, right? But he was, So these are people who they were clearly outsiders. They weren't part of the game, et cetera. And again, there's a reason why, of course, these people were attracted to Trump and Trump was attracted to them, right? But I think in the end, it was perhaps more problematic than helpful. So the career bureaucrat, might be the kind of figure that real mavericks coming into Washington might be most wary of. But there are also people who know how the system works and they know what you need to be effective within the system. This is true of those who worked for the Trump agenda in the bureaucracy and those who worked against it. So one might say, for example, that there are few creatures who are more readily identified with the Washington swamp than career politicians, right? Who've made a life out of serving in elected office. But undoubtedly, one of the most effective players in the past 4 years in carrying out the Trump agenda in regard to the selection and confirming of federal judges, including Supreme Court, is Mitch McConnell. There's no question about that. Why? Because he knows how things work. That's why. So Trump's policies were sometimes seriously hindered by a lack of knowledge of the arcane mysteries of things like the Administrative Procedures Act. Success in navigating policies through the labyrinth of federal procedures requires a detailed knowledge of exactly how you abide by such requirements. And someone coming in from the outside lacking that knowledge is simply going to confront a significant challenge. It's very difficult. So success in Washington for someone like Trump requires finding people who know how to pull strings and know where the strings are to be pulled, yet who haven't been captured by the system in such a way that they're hostile to the policies represented by people like President Trump. Give you well, I'll come back to that later. Okay, let me turn. Yeah, let me say something about what to expect from the Biden administration, and then some concluding comments. So, for however long President Biden serves in office, I started a sentence with those words the other day in class, and students reacted with a kind of chuckle. I didn't actually mean it to be humorous or even a stab at the president. I simply really meant whether he serves one term or two terms. That is what I meant, but you can believe me or not believe me. But here's, and I'm in fact actually suspect of any conspiracy argument that some of you may have heard, that the Democrats really put Biden up as a candidate because they knew that he wouldn't last, and they wanted to force him to select Kamala Harris as his running mate so that she could quickly replace him and push through a much more progressive agenda. It was talking, by the way, I will say this occurred to me actually even prior to in October when Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi made this comment about the 25th Amendment. She, well, we got to revive, we have to think about this and all. So I thought she was not talking about Trump, but she was talking about a new Biden presidency. For those of you who might not know, the story in Washington is that Nancy Pelosi is not very fond of Joe Biden. They're not close friends. In fact, if you look back at the first Trump impeachment, without question, one of the consequences of the first, without question, I'd say one of the consequences of the first Trump impeachment would be to raise the question of Ukraine and Biden and his son, Hunter Biden. So you would think that the Democrats might not push that since Biden was the front runner at the time. Right? And I think I thought was likely to win the nomination. I said that even in December, even in January when he was, his numbers were floundering. I thought that was the case. So there seems to be a little love lost between the two of them. But I don't think it's the case that this was the plan. First of all, candidate Biden painted himself into the circle of choosing Senator Harris as his running mate when he pledged to put a minority woman on the ticket. Senator Harris was the clear front runner once that occurred, and for a variety of reasons. And it didn't come as a shock then when he named her over the summer. But even the most ardent progressive understands that Senator Harris was not the most popular figure in the party. There's a reason she dropped out of the election as a candidate before the first votes were cast. But don't the really progressive Democrats want to push Biden out of office? Well, maybe, but it's important to keep this in mind. Joe Biden has wanted to be president of the United States for the past 50 years. And he has a large coterie of friends and allies about him who have been with, many of whom have been with him for decades. These people are not simply going to say, hey, we won. Let's hand the reins of the country over to somebody else. No, right? They're going to hold on to their positions with their very being, in spite of or because of the relative weakness of President Biden, including what seem to be very real physical and mental challenges. I see no evidence of the group of his staff and now a whole administrative apparatus simply turning over the executive branch to someone else. So what might we expect out of a Biden administration? Well, certainly the things which he's already done. So he's acted very quickly, right, in issuing executive orders and memorandums and findings, et cetera. Some having to do with the COVID pandemic, of course, some having to do with immigration, healthcare more broadly, statements already about taxes and the new budget, et cetera. Social policies are very important, abortion, transgender, military policies, et cetera. But I've also mentioned that, and one important element that will undoubtedly arise, though I haven't seen a lot of it yet, and that is Biden derangement syndrome. So derangement syndrome, people often talk about this Trump derangement syndrome. Look, there was Obama derangement syndrome, there was Bush derangement syndrome, there was Clinton derangement syndrome. What I mean by that, I don't know what others mean by it, but what I mean by it is this, that you despise the other side so much that you can't think clearly about them, okay? And politically, this is a significant problem. In particular, in elections, it's a significant problem, right? That is, you have to be able to think about why people are voting for the other guy and why they might vote for you instead. And if you just think, well, this guy is a dope, right? This guy is a hack or whatever it might be, you are going to lose the election. You're going to lose, right? Elections are won and lost, right? On the basis of whether or not you can capture some of the vote of people who voted for the other guy. Right? That's the way it works. And if you despise that individual so much that you can't think about how to run a campaign to beat him, right? You're going to lose. So it's a problem, right? But let me just mention one thing, which I think we've seen already, which gives an indication of the trajectory of the new administration, and which I think also suggests that it's not that different from the way that previous administrations have operated. So President Biden has been around the block a few times, right? He knows how the game is played. Politics is in large part about promises and expectations and the degree to which one can manage the fallout from not being able to meet the bloated promises made during the heat of a campaign. So when during the campaign, when then candidate Vice President Biden said, you know, I'm not going to shut down the country, I'm going to shut down the virus, right? And that we're going to be ready from day one, right? We're going to be dealing with this. And then in the past week, it says, well, there's nothing we can do to change the trajectory of the pandemic in the next several months, right? That's the reality of things. So the big plan was, the new plan that was introduced was to get to 1 million vaccinations a day. At that point, when that promise was made, I think there were 940,000 vaccinations a day in America. So the big plan was 60,000 more a day. Okay, it's a reworking, but it's not a total transformation. And so the president said this the other day. It's no secret. So this was, I think, what day is today? Saturday. I think this was Tuesday or Wednesday. It's no secret, he said, that we have recently discovered in the final days of the transition, and it wasn't until the final days we got the kind of cooperation we needed, that once we arrived, the vaccine program is in worse shape than we anticipated or expected. A lot of you who follow this, and then he says, of course, this is, he's a smart, Biden is a smart guy. Okay, I mean, he's been in Washington a long time. He knows politics. That's what I mean by he knows politics. Right? So he says this. A lot of you. So he's talking to the press, right? A lot of you who follow this, and nobody is. I mean, the press is the smartest group of people in town. Like, could you imagine Trump ever saying that? Right? No, but Biden knows this, right? This is the way to win them over. He says, I think you found the same thing, right? That is that this is just a mess, and we didn't get anything, right, in the transition period. Well, the chief of staff of HHS then was asked about this and said, you know, what did you do? What did you lead? Did you help these guys? He said, we had over 300 meetings with the Biden people in the transition period, right? And so for them to say we didn't get any help in the transition is not true, simply not true. But this, of course, is just the way politics works. Right? There's nothing unusual here. The fact we're talking, other than the fact that we're talking about how to deal with the COVID pandemic, right? That's the way politics works. Is you make promises that you can be better than the guy you're running against, and then if and when you win, you blame him for not being able to say what you said you would do. Not unique to a Biden administration, and it won't be the only issue about which we hear such talk. But generally speaking, I think we give presidents way too much credit when things go well in the country and way too much blame for when they don't. Presidents have, I think, at most a marginal effect on things such as the growth rate of the economy, international affairs, et cetera. Okay, a last conclusion. So connect us with UD politics. Many of you have read Machiavelli already. Machiavelli argues in The Prince that the success of a prince, this is chapter 25, that the success of a prince will depend in large part on whether or not his natural bent or inclinations are in tune with the times. That is, if the ruler is cautious, but the times call for someone who is impetuous, he will likely not be successful. Similarly, if the ruler is impetuous and the times call for caution, he will not be successful. And he notes, since most people cannot change their character or their inclinations, they normally are simply going to have to go with their inclination or bent and try to make it work. And if you want to make it work, then, not surprisingly, Machiavelli suggests that you be impetuous, because you're more likely to be successful. But sometimes caution is the better approach to ruling. In part, that's true, because even though they sometimes like it and like to promote it, people normally tire of constant motion, of perpetual upset, and they seek calm or rest. But one of the important questions of the contemporary world is whether, in fact, that is still true. That is it true that people seek out calm waters? Or can those calm waters be found if they do seek out such calm waters? Modern technology, I think, has rendered it far more difficult to step away from the fray, to collect one's thoughts, and to think deeply about where we are, how we got here, and what can and ought to be done at this point. One solution to our problem, a political solution, is to turn to the law, and a restoration, which I think is essential, of the fundamental principle of the rule of law. But the larger and more profound solution to our times isn't to be found here. Indeed, it's to recognize how limited those goods are that we seek politically in light of the final end, right? The salvation of our souls. As Solzhenitsyn put it in his Harvard commencement speech, it is true that in Western democracies, we fight for the protection of our rights and freedoms. And what marks us as different from totalitarian societies is that we see those matters as important. But he notes, we also have the right to not have our divine souls stuffed with trivial and harmful material, for that surely creates an obstacle to deep reflection on the most important purpose we have here on earth. But let me end with a point about American politics, and in particular, the institution of the presidency. In Federalist 51, a text which I know is near and dear to your hearts, Publius commences a discussion of the separation of powers by asserting that the first measure that must be put in place to ensure that the separation of powers operates properly is to divide up the powers of the government so that each branch has a will of its members, has a will of its own, and that its members are chosen separately, and yet each of them by the people, right? That is in each of the branches. But then he goes on to say that if we followed that principle to the letter, it might create some difficulties. And in particular, it create difficulties in the judiciary. And so he says, so of course, we don't have the judiciary elected, right, by the people. Well, why not? Well, what he says is this. This is a passage from Federalist 51. He says, in the constitution of the Judiciary Department, it might be inexpedient to insist rigorously on the principle that is, of the people choosing the members. Why? He gives two reasons. First, because peculiar qualifications being essential in the members, the primary consideration ought to be to select that mode of choice which best secures these qualifications. I'll come back to that. Secondly, he says, because the permanent tenure by which the appointments are held in the judiciary must soon destroy all sense of dependence on the authority conferring them. The second one seems to me, can go both ways, right? That is, he's saying because they're permanent, then they're not dependent upon the body that chose them anymore, right? So that's a fundamental principle of representation and responsibility, right? Re-election. They're not re-elected, and so we shouldn't be so concerned about it in the first place. Well, I think one might argue the opposite. That is, because they're not re-elected, all the more reason why the people might have a say in who they are in the first place. I'm not arguing for that. I'm just saying that seems to me not unreasonable, not wholly unreasonable argument. But the first point is more important for our purposes. That is, so what he says is peculiar qualifications being essential in the members of the judiciary. Now, of course, you know, the Constitution doesn't actually have any requirements for the members of the judiciary, but so they're not that kind of qualification. What he seems to mean is knowledge of the law, what we like to call today judicial temperament. That means what that means today is if it's someone I don't like, they don't have judicial temperament. And you know, that sort of thing, right? That's, you know, some experience maybe in a courtroom, not that important, but might be useful. But his point is, because there are peculiar qualifications we want in judges, right? Then we should adopt that mode of selection, which gets us the best judges. Okay, I want to suggest that we should think about that principle for other offices as well. That is, don't we want the best senators and the best representatives, right, as well? Best governors, state legislators, dog catchers. So shouldn't we think about the mode of selection, right, for them? Like what gets the best person in the office? We've sought, again, it's not a simple answer. So we've sought, I would say, for over a century to democratize the selection system for the presidency as for all offices. And the question that we're left with is what has been the consequence of that approach? We've introduced the primary system, for example, in the nomination process so that the candidate is chosen by the people and not by the party. So when Donald Trump came down the famous golden escalator in 2015, he could have announced that he was running for the Democratic nomination rather than the Republican. We made it much easier for people to register to vote and to actually vote. We've expanded the vote in all kinds of ways. But what are the consequences of the changes we've introduced? Do we in fact get better presidents on the whole from this new system than we did under the older arrangement? That seems to me a much more important question than whether or not the system is democratic enough. Now, one answer to that question may very well be that the way we ensure that we get better presidents is to make the selection system more democratic. Right? And why might that be? Well, because perhaps the first order of business in making the government work in a democratic or Republican order, small d, small r order, is to provide some degree of legitimacy to the office holder's place in the system. And perhaps a less democratic mode of selection would undermine that critical element of the public order. I'm not saying then that the current system of selecting the president produces worse presidents, nor am I saying that removing the selection of judges from the hands of the voters necessarily produces better judges. We could, of course, test that proposition somewhat when we compare elected judges in America to non-elected judges, and that's going to involve our own judgment about such things. What I am saying is that it's a really important question that we should think about. Do we, in fact, get better presidents under our system of selection than we did before? Polls show, though we can't trust the polls, of course, polls show that people overwhelmingly are disappointed in the selection available to them when they go in to vote in November or October or September or whenever they do vote. But of course, like these are the two candidates you have, and yes, easily 70% or more of people say, "I wish there was somebody else on the ballot." But of course, we have no one to blame other than ourselves for the options that appear. After all, these candidates were nominated by the people themselves in the primary system. So maybe what we really need is more self-reflection, and that's never a bad option. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer your questions. Yes.
One of the questions that I've seen in the Wall Street Journal.
Sorry, I'm gonna tell you, my hearing is not that great, so if you'd speak up, that'd be good.
One of the questions that's been coming up in the Wall Street Journal is whether or not President Biden is going to be pushing a more progressive agenda, listening to the cabinet that he's put around him, or if he's going to try to stick to the message that he put in the inauguration of unity, everybody work together. Which do you think it's going to go?
Dr. Dougherty, could you repeat the question into the?
Oh, yeah. So the question is, in places like the Wall Street Journal, they're raising the question of whether President Biden will promote the principle of unity, which he articulated in the inaugural address, or whether he's going to promote a more progressive agenda that certainly a sector of the Democratic Party would favor. I think, yes, I think he's going to try to do both. And by that, I mean, I think that, so one of the, I think Biden himself he's not a progressive. There's not really almost nothing in his background that suggests that. However, almost nothing. That doesn't mean nothing. It is the case that the president was, in fact, a very important player in certain ways. So, for those of you who aren't aware of it, we have now pretty much settled the question of same-sex marriage in America. I mean, that argument is pretty much over, right? For the most part, right, in the public realm. It was Joe Biden who, in the spring of 2012, said, "Well, of course, same-sex marriage is okay, it's legitimate. We should embrace that." Before the president did that, so I don't think any major politician in America had ever articulated that view until Joe Biden did in the spring. Well, I'll say the spring of 2012. I think it was April of 2012. It was really important. Within a year, right, virtually every Democrat in office came out in favor of same-sex marriage. So there are certain issues where I think President Biden has, in fact, actually been leading the way. But I don't think his bent is actually in that direction. He did certainly articulate a lot of much more progressive views during the campaign, during the Democratic primaries, many of which he backtracked on in the general election. So, I would say the way to make a judgment about where he wants to go with such things. So, well, I guess I'd put it this way. So you'd have to look at, the way to see it is to look at the personnel, right? Who is he putting in place? And I think generally speaking, what one might expect is that he will push a more progressive domestic policy and a less progressive foreign policy. That's the way it looks to me. Like the foreign policy people that he's aligned is like, it's the old gang gotten together again. So I don't know. So that's my expectation. Yeah.
Come back to the point, you said you might have another story about it, and then you stopped. This is about the problem that there just aren't that many people who both supported the president's agenda President Trump's agenda on the one hand, and know anything about how Washington works on the other. So we had this.
Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Very much so. Yes. So what do you? Let's just say hypothetically that there's nothing that's going to change about that for at least 10 or 15 years. I mean, even if there was some sort of influx tomorrow of 23-year-old conservatives into Washington, it would still take 10 or 15 years before they were actually, and that doesn't seem to be happening anyways. But let's just so for the next 2 to 3 presidential terms, nothing about that situation will change. What does that mean for Republicans and for conservatives?
Yeah. So I guess I would say this, see if this makes sense, that are we talking about Trump, or are we talking about conservative movement, or?
However you.
So I would say that the possibilities of success for any kind of conservative movement in Washington over the next decade will require somehow cobbling together the coalition, which existed in various ways and various manifestations during the Reagan years and the Bush years. You have social conservatives and libertarians and others who are at odds with each other in some significant ways. And you somehow have to be able to make an appeal to those people to unite, right? So that now one difficulty, of course, is there's no, in doing that, I think one difficulty is I don't see a single issue that in fact unites them. So you might say, might rally to a cause and say, okay, this is the hill we're going to die on, but what is it? And so it's always going to be, I think, a kind of cobbling together of certain interests for better or worse, and it's not going to be it's not going to satisfy completely anyone. So I think that's really the only way it's going to work. But I guess I would add that on the question of who's going to Washington, who is going to do these things, like let me frame it in this way. For people who are dissatisfied with what's going on in Washington and what's going on in the country as a whole, but in particular, I mean in regard to politics, not other issues. It seems to me there is one way of reducing the significant way of reducing the friction that is an essential part of our divisions today, and that is reducing the power of the federal government. These issues, think about the debates over the Brett Kavanaugh nomination or something like that. Why is it such a big deal? Why is it the case that people are willing to do the kinds of crazy things that they're doing, right, as a result of this? It's because so much power is at stake. That's why. They know that, right? Everybody knows that. So, when Kavanaugh was in his nomination hearings, and he was, so the aftermath of the charges brought against him, and his I think legitimate rage in response to it. And he was asked by one of the senators, I forget who, well, you said that we're out to get you, and that's not true. It was on the Democratic side, right? That's not true. I mean, after all, last year, 2 years before that, we approved Neil Gorsuch, and like you're the same guy. I mean, he's a clone basically of Neil Gorsuch, and so that was fine. We didn't give him this kind of business we're giving you, and. Now, what Kavanaugh couldn't say, of course, in response to this was, well, yeah, but I'm replacing somebody different, right? He was replacing Scalia. I'm replacing somebody different. That makes all the difference in the world, right? But Kavanaugh couldn't say that, right? But everybody knows that, right? Well, why does that make such a difference? Why does it make such a difference whether Anthony Kennedy is on the court? That I think is deeply problematic for America in all kinds of ways. So one solution would be, now, the difficulty is that's not going to happen, right? And so the question then is really not whether we're going to have that centralized power, but whose hand is on the lever. And once you get your hand on the lever, will you give it up? Will you let go of it? Will you hand that lever back to the states or local governments or whatever, or just the people themselves? I don't see that happen. So I don't know if that's an answer. So, part of it, I do think part of it is that, who is attracted to working in Washington, right? It just seems to me overwhelmingly progressive who are attracted to that. Well, are other questions come? Yes.
So you mentioned forming a coalition between conservative and conservative. Okay. You mentioned, forming a conservative coalition in order to, just kind of play the inside game of Washington. And I think, as a young conservative myself, I have been very disappointed with how some of the more establishment conservatives have handled this, where in order to play the inside game, you always end up pacifying, or they won't take a strong stance on what they say they will. So you just keep re-electing these deadbeats to political office. And so for me, the Trump administration was, maybe not always successful in its approach, but it was definitely, I finally saw someone actually fighting for what they said they believed in, and that for me was really important. And so I guess my concern is, I don't think, and a lot of my conservative friends, we don't necessarily want a coalition with these establishment Republicans anymore, because we feel like our trust has been betrayed.
Yeah.
And maybe it's youth, maybe it's idealism, maybe it's a combination of both, but we want to shake things up, and we don't necessarily want to participate in this anymore. So is there a way, I guess my question is, to do that without, to make change in Washington without having to partner with these very shrewd politicians who are politicians, and their end goal is to stay in office, not to create social change?
Dr. Dougherty, repeat the question if you would.
Yeah. Okay. So the question is, and I think this goes actually for, and not just for conservatives, it goes for progressives as well. Do you? So the question. So I don't want to put words in your mouth. So let me phrase it this way. There are those on both sides, I would say, both the progressive and conservative side, who are not interested in working with the, let's say, the party apparatus, right? The establishment groups, because they water down the concerns that these other groups have, right? And they don't in the views of sort of Trump conservatives or Tea Party conservatives, however however you would describe them, or sort of the AOC progressives, you get in bed with these politicians, and they don't act, right? They don't do what they say they would do, and so you would rather not do that, right? So can you do that and be successful? I think the answer, can you take that position, right, and say, I'm not going to deal with these people and be successful? I think the answer is no. The answer is no. So you can think of it these terms. This is a reason why we read such things, right? In Federalist 10, right? What you see is, I don't want to say any one of these groups is necessarily a faction, but some of them can be, right? And what happens? The more extreme the faction, let me say extreme, the more pure, right, the group, the smaller it's going to be. And if you want to be successful in politics, you have to get a majority. So, if you say, I'm a Trump supporter and I'm not gonna work is there a more establishment person than Mitch McConnell? You say, I'm not going to work with him. Well, good luck. Right? I mean, what do you think is going to happen? Right? You're gonna be run out of town on a rail, completely unsuccessful. But you would have held the banner high and said, I fought the good fight. Right? Okay, there's something to be said for that, by the way. I don't want to downplay that. There is something to be said for it, and maybe what's to be said for it is down the road you might be more successful, right? But in the meantime, it's just not the way politics works, right? You form a coalition. You want to bring in someone who has a slightly different position, or whose concern is, whose issues are different than yours, right? So you might be interested in climate, they're interested in taxes, whatever it might be. You know, you have to moderate your position a bit, right? In order to get them, because they might not really be on board with all of that stuff, but enough of it where, you know, they can unite with you. Again, I have an admiration for the purity of certain political positions, and that's fine. It has its place, I think, but not in Washington. Not being successful in Washington. So part of that is, but I'd add something to that, though, I think. And that, oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. I'd add something to that, and that is, so what I'm suggesting really is, in large part, is that, you know, politics is, you have to make prudential judgments about things. And you have to look at the circumstances in front of you and say, you know, what can I accomplish at this point? Now, it's often easy to downplay the possibilities, right? Because it might make it easier for you. Say, well, I can't really do that. Well, maybe you could. I mean, if you pushed it a little bit further. I think what's crucial is that as you act prudentially, you bear in mind constantly and perhaps sometimes articulate clearly what the fundamental principle is. Right? That's what you're really driven by, but that you recognize that circumstances compel you to do this. This is not a perfect example, but one that I thought of before. So I knew a guy who taught at Brigham Young University for many years, and I was talking about hiring, and he said, you know, one of the problems we have at BYU is we want to hire Mormons, but really we only have one college university that we want them to go to, and it's BYU. But we don't really want to hire all of our own, right? I mean, they want to be more academically respectable, and so you want to hire people who are outside of the BYU gambit. There actually is one or two other schools now, I think, but this was some years ago. So he said, here's what we need, right? Then, and you know, so think about the difficulty. What we need is someone who's a committed Mormon who goes to a secular university, right? For college, and then they go on to get a PhD. You know, again, at probably some secular university, right? You want it to be, you know, whatever. And then, but maintains, right, their Mormon faith, right, through all of that, right, maintains that they're solid, right, and orthodox, and then we can hire them here. It's really hard for them to go through all of that and maintain what you would like to have, right, for a faculty member at BYU. John, did you have? Yeah.
How swampy are state governments? And you know, is there any will of state governments to resist the federal swamp? Going forward, I mean, even something like, you know, like a Jackson moment where you say, like, well, they've made their decision, like, let's see them enforce it. I mean, that already happens in a lot of ways, right? Like sanctuary cities, sanctuary states, where local jurisdictions say, like, man, like they have a law, but they're not going to enforce it, and that happens, right? So
yeah.
How do you think that's increasingly likely? You know, after the bitterness of the Trump, you know, of the Trump election, Trump failure to be reelected.
Yeah. I think only at the margins. So the question is, are state governments, again, correct me if I'm not, are state governments like the federal government in the sense in which it's, you know, sort of hard to manage your way through things, change policies, et cetera. And to what degree are they independent of the federal government? This I think is actually a significant development over the last couple of decades. I mean, there's some of it prior to that, but I think one of the significant developments is actually the rise of interest in federalism. Not states' rights. That's something very different, of course. But you know, so in regard to like the initial movements towards same-sex marriage, for example, things like end-of-life decisions, marijuana, right? It's still prohibited at the federal level, but it states they're because it's not people aren't charged with it, et cetera. So there is something of a sanctuary cities again would be another good example. So there's something of some degree of independence, let's say, that state and local governments might be able to exercise, but really only at the wink and nod of the federal government allowing it. So I just discovered this recently, actually. I didn't even know about it because it kind of struck me over the last, since all the healthcare debates came up, mostly like with the Affordable Care Act, et cetera. Like why is it the case that that you can't buy insurance across state lines? Where in America is it the case that states have authority over this? This seems to me to be crazy. So this was, Marco Rubio. I remember he was so frustrated in one of the presidential debates where Trump was saying, he's like, well, what's your plan? And Rubio goes into this detailed analysis of reforms for healthcare, et cetera. And then Trump says, yeah, just get rid of the lines. Like that's all. Rubio's like, that's it. That's all it worked, right? Well, why is it the case? Well, I discovered this is actually an agreement entered into between the federal government and the states 60, 70 years ago. That the federal government said, look, you can have control over this kind of these insurance plans, et cetera, as long as we approve of it. But if you start messing up, then we're going to intervene. I mean, it clearly seems to me a question of interstate commerce under our understanding of interstate commerce. So there again, it's really at the disposal of the federal government to allow such things, and they have allowed some more, but they always seem to be in one direction, and that is progressive, right? Well, I shouldn't say that. Well, I'll say that. I'm thinking that some of them are more libertarian and not necessarily progressive, but they're on issues I think where libertarians and progressives are actually on the same page. So yes.
As a person who is a leftist, very far on the left, I think that, in my view, that it was very important to impeach him a second time for literally inciting violence by saying, be there, be wild, not peacefully protesting against the confirmation of Joe Biden's presidency. I was going to ask I know you brought up the point that because we use it often, twice, on the same president, that it kind of diminishes the value of impeaching somebody. I don't know if I agree, but I wonder if you could talk about that more.
Yeah, sure. So on the
question, Rich?
Oh yeah. So the question is why not impeach the president that he incited the riot or violence or whatever, however we might describe it. How we describe it is of course important. On January 6th, and so the point would be what you want to do is send a message that this is the kind of thing that we don't countenance in America. I mean, is that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think there is an argument for that, right? I think that if the impeachment movement, so the larger point first, that if you're going to impeach there is a process, right, for impeaching the president, and you want to ensure that you follow it. The impeachment is of course not simply a legal question, right? It's a political question, and it's the choices are made by political people, right? So you can't, and I think shouldn't expect political people to be making choices about such things that are not grounded in large part in their political views of such things. So that's understood. I mean, so I don't consider impeachment to be simply a legal question. I do think so. It's political. But my point about sort of trivializing the impeachment principle, practice, et cetera, is that, if you think, for example, that that what Trump did on not just on January 6th, but on leading up to it, right? That's an impeachable offense. But you were 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, you thought what was an impeachable offense for the president was that he, like in the months between his election and taking office, if you argued that it was an impeachable offense that he was moving too slowly on making appointments to his administration, that undermines your claim that now this is an impeachable offense. So that's really what I meant by that, in part, was that if you bring it up at every occasion, right, that, oh yeah, this is a reason for impeaching the president. That's what I mean by sort of reducing the importance or significance of impeachment. So I understand that there is a reason why people think he should be impeached, right? And now, so I recognize that. I would suggest that for the Biden administration, it's a distraction, right? It's a distraction, and I guess in the end, I would say Trump. He's a larger than life figure, and he has gotten in the heads of both his supporters and his opponents. And his opponents wanted to impeach him before he took office, and they want to impeach him after he leaves office. He has been a huge moneymaker for news, and what they're going to do in the aftermath of the Trump presidency, I'm not really sure, but they will miss him. They will miss him, not in the way that Trump would want them to miss him, but they will miss him.
Okay, I hate to call an end to this. It's been great. Thank you so much, Rich.